All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IWM for what is our last public event of this academic year. Thank you for being with us over and over again over the past year for the many discussions, lectures, and other events that we've been able to have here. I am Kate Younger. I'm a permanent fellow here at the IWM, and I run our Ukrainian European Dialogue and Documenting Ukraine programs. And I'm very glad to welcome you tonight for a lecture followed by a discussion. Tonight we will hear from Taras Fedirko, Liberty After Liberalism, Emancipatory Struggles in Ukrainian Journalism over the past 30 years, leading up to the full-scale invasion. Taras is a lecturer in, I have it here somewhere, lecturer in organized crime and corruption at the University of Glasgow. Taras does many things, and so I was deciding where to begin here. And the most important right now is that he is a Ukrainian European Dialogue visiting fellow here at the IWM. After Taras's talk, we'll then turn to a discussion with Tim Snyder, who is professor at Yale University as well as a permanent fellow here at the IWM, and Mary Kaldor, who's professor for global governance at the LSE. So Taras, the floor is yours.
Before I begin, I'd like to say thank the IWM and personally Kate for hosting me here for the last 2.5 months and giving me the opportunity to develop some of the thoughts that you will hear today, for better or worse. And I'm also grateful to my two distinguished discussants for the engagement with my work and to Peace Rep Ukraine, which is a project at the LSE, which has brought many of us here in the audience, as well as me here today. So by way of disclaimer, I have to say that this is my first attempt to develop a unifying framework for an ethnographic material that I have been working on for a while. So the edifice, as it were, is a little wobbly still, but I look forward to your comments that will make it hopefully a bit more stable. So on the evening of the 2nd of February 2021, 3 all-news TV channels in Ukraine, Zik, 112 and News 1, were abruptly shut down by presidential decree. Some of you might remember that. The decree froze the assets of the channel's de facto owner, the opposition member of parliament, Taras Kozak. Acting as a front for his close ally Viktor Medvedchuk, Kozak had purchased the channels in 2019, prompting an exodus of journalistic staff who rightly anticipated that their news programs would be used to promote Medvedchuk in his political project. Viktor Medvedchuk, an experienced political operative and old friend of Vladimir Putin, in fact a fictive kin of Putin's, returned to political prominence in Ukraine after 2014 when he became a crucial mediator between the Kremlin and President Poroshenko's administration in Kyiv. He used his Russian connections, Medvedchuk that is, used his Russian connections and revenues from lucrative coal and fuel trade businesses in Russia and the separatist People's Republics in East Ukraine to become one of the leaders of Opposition Platform for Life, or OPFL, OPZZ in Ukrainian, a parliamentary party that united many former allies of President Yanukovych ousted in the 2013-14 Maidan or Euromaidan revolution. Medvedchuk's channels broadcasted programs where guests and journalists criticized Ukraine's post-Euromaidan Euro-Atlantic turn, denounced the legacy of the revolution, praised life in separatist republics in Donbass, and called for the implementation of the Minsk peace accords and closer ties with Russia. They also ran programs such as It Stinks of Soros, to denounce the Sorosiata grant eaters in Ukraine, liberally borrowing from Orban's playbook. Media critics argued that these media were responsible for an increasing share of Ukraine's pro-Russian propaganda. One calculation had it about 60% in 2019, I think. But despite repeated attempts, Zelensky's government could not rein them in. As the government floundered and alienated its former voters, OPFL climbed up in the polls, and soon it came first in the local elections in 4 regions in Ukraine, beating Zelensky's servant of the people, and by early 2021, OPFL became the main potential challenger of President's parliamentary majority. The sanctions hit where it hurt. With the state having impounded their money, media, and private jets that Kozak and Medvedchuk used to travel to Moscow, the party stood little chance of building enough support to impose its agenda on Zelensky's administration. An attack on parliamentary opposition, the sanctions were also hit at Russia's influence in Ukraine. Now, the sanctions took many within Kyiv's journalistic core by surprise. On the morning after the channels were shut down, my Facebook feed filled with celebratory posts about the sanctions. The most vocal support came from a small minority of Kyiv's journalistic community, a group of reporters, editors, and staff of watchdog NGOs that made up what I have called the movement for the reform of the journalistic profession in Ukraine. Members of the activist minority have dedicated their careers to promoting independent journalism, незалежна журналістика in Ukrainian, and through it a Western-orientated liberal democracy since some 20 years by that point. Comments on the sanctions by several former employees at Hromadske, an online public broadcaster and a key organization in the movement where I conducted most of my fieldwork a couple of years before that, were particularly revealing. A former senior producer wrote, "Such good news. I hope this harmful media will be shut down forever." Another staffer posted a video of himself. Solemn, hand on heart as if for a performance of the national anthem, he stood in front of a TV screen that showed a test card in place of a sanctioned channel's broadcast. These reactions were echoed in statements of professional organizations forming the backbone of the movement, such as the Independent Media Council, Institute for Mass Information, and Detector Media, as well as by the movement's main funders, the G7 embassies in Kyiv, USAID, and others. I was surprised by the broad support for the sanctions within the reforms movement among its funders, but mainly outside of the movement within the broader journalistic profession. Why would journalists, let alone activists who had routinely mobilized against censorship, support a government ban that set a dangerous precedent? 1,500 journalists were left jobless. Why did the profession show no solidarity? Why should media reform organizations, which for a decade and a half used Western grants to promote freedom of speech, seemingly turn against their principles? Now, I'm an anthropologist, and I like, kind of as a proverb go, to make the strange familiar and familiar strange and to complicate matters. And so I'll be digging into this seeming paradox. And I'll show that this apparent paradox of media reformers for state censorship is only a paradox if you interpret the events through the lens of the liberal notion of freedom of speech. And that is not how most of my interlocutors saw it. Of course, different parties made reference to the ideal of free speech. So, following the sanctions, National Union of Journalists of Ukraine harshly criticized the ban as an attack on media freedom, and it was backed by the international and European federations of journalists, which called the sanctions, quote, an extrajudicial and potentially motivated ban, or a politically motivated ban, and a blatant attack on press freedom that must be urgently reversed. The banned channels echoed this rhetoric. Unsurprisingly, the Ukrainian authorities rejected this framing. So, for example, President Zelensky tweeted that, quote, Ukraine decisively supports freedom of speech, but not propaganda financed by the aggressor state, which undermines Ukraine on its way to the EU and Euro-Atlantic integration. The struggle for independence is a struggle for truth and European values in an information war. Zelensky, of course, might have been cynical, but his statement resonated with large parts of the media profession that supported the sanctions. My interlocutors at Hromadske and other organizations insisted that it was correct to see the ban, that it was incorrect to see the ban as government infringement of freedom of speech. Minister of Culture Alexander Tkachenko said that, quote, it is doubtful that these media, which followed Kremlin's instructions, could be called free media or media that are worthy of protection. Of course, Tkachenko is not exactly the protector of freedom of speech, but let's quote him here because it suits me. But a media critic for Detector Media, kind of more pertinently to this, a key organization in the reform movement, echoed Tkachenko and wrote that to begin with, one needs to understand that at Medvedchuk's TV channel there was never any freedom of speech as such. The hosts worked for the interests of the opposition Platform for Life. Medvedchuk's channels were most dependent news channels in Ukraine, and they first of all had to gain their freedom of speech from their owner. The consensus was that since the channels were not free in the first instance, sanctions were legitimate. Lack of freedom justified, therefore, restrictions of freedom. Clearly, distinct understandings of freedom were at stake. Among the critics of the sanctions, a liberal notion of freedom from interference, and among their supporters, freedom as non-domination. These two notions approximated the two words for liberty in the Ukrainian and Russian language. Svoboda, associated with negative liberty, so svoboda slova, freedom of speech, and voля, somewhere between positive liberty, sovereignty of will, and non-domination. In what follows, I will argue that the media profession's embrace of the sanctions against fellow journalists was the result of a 2-decade-long struggle against the domination of media by patrons such as Medvedchuk. The media reform movement began in the early 2000s as a movement of labor solidarity against censorial workplace controls engineered, ironically, by Medvedchuk himself for President Kuchma's administration. But over 2 subsequent decades, Russian interference, patronal domination, and organizational imperatives of grants promoting freedom of speech have transformed the movement into a divisive, moralized struggle over who counts as real journalists in Ukraine. The sanctions and reactions to them within the media profession were a culmination of this transformation. So, my project traces these changes This is a book project, and what I'm presenting today is kind of a framework for the book. So my project traces these changes and takes them as an occasion for a broader reflection about the meaning and practice of liberty in contemporary Ukraine. For several years at the Maidan, those visiting Kyiv's Independence Square saw two giant banners spread across the burnt-out facade of the trade union house. Freedom is our religion. Both in Ukrainian and in Russian. In Ukrainian and in English. That was a funny slip. In no ambivalent terms, the slogan conveyed the core idea of the post-Maidan political project, namely, that as a collective act of mass insubordination, a rejection of arbitrary domination could be a foundation for the national community. This was a kind of eventful nationalism anyway. At this year's anniversary of the Maidan death, the Maidan's killings, in fact, President Zelensky referenced another classic trope of the revolution. Slaves aren't free to enter paradise. This is the meaning of the Ukrainian interpretation of liberty, he said. So in Ukrainian, рабів до раю не пускають. Це сенс українського тлумачення волі. And he uses воля rather than свобода. I think that a similar understanding of freedom grounded journalists' support for sanctions against Zik, News One, and 112. According to this notion of liberty, you aren't free if you are dependent on the will of someone else. A discussion of the historical sources of this Republican liberty, or New Roman liberty, if you will, if you prefer Skinner over Petit, and liberty as non-domination, is beyond my lecture. Certainly, sources were many, from Marxism and its notion of dependent labor as wage slavery, to anti-imperial Ukrainian nationalism, to Cossack republican ideas and their reverberations of the Cossack myth, all the way through to Maidan. Whatever the sources, those taking up this notion of freedom, be they journalists or protesters at Maidan, elaborated and used it in response to concrete political and economic circumstances in Ukraine. Since the late 1990s, this has meant increasing prominence and fierce competition of oligarchs inside the patronal political system. This system emerged on the ruins of the Soviet order from the interaction between old Soviet patronage networks and new patrons seeking to make use of the transition to capitalist market and liberal democracy. Part of the momentous post-Cold War global experiment in liberating the world through capitalist market and liberal democracy, this process was profoundly affected by independence Ukraine integration into the global economic and political system. Now, how have these experiments affected the understanding of liberty in the former Soviet empire of justice? To what extent did the so-called transition to market capitalism and liberal democracy in Ukraine shape the forms of domination and struggles against them that are registered in the kinds of freedom that Ukrainians have yearned for? What does liberty look like after liberalism? Quentin Skinner famously excavated the reception of Roman Republican ideas in early modern England to reveal an understanding of liberty as non-domination that created the conditions for, and later was eclipsed by, a new liberal notion of freedom as non-interference in the 18th century. One can wonder whether it is the other way around in Ukraine. To what extent did the practical idea of freedom as non-domination within the movement respond to the concrete shape that market freedoms and freedom of speech took in Ukrainian journalism? Typically for the region, among the journalists I have studied, the Republican idea of freedom set together with other clearly liberal positions, such as a nearly unqualified embrace of the market as an ideal that would liberate all of them. This Republican liberal synthesis, difficult to imagine if reasoned in terms of grand traditions of political thought implied, for instance, in Skinner's work, here was a matter of vernacular political reasoning of journalists who from the early 1990s embraced and responded to the westernizing project of promoting liberal democracy and capitalism in the country. Moreover, for journalists, this synthesis took place in the context of a profession that was thoroughly internationalized and after 1991 was open to foreign capital and Anglo-American liberal model of journalistic professionalism that emphasized objectivity, impartiality, and a commitment to professional standards and ethics. And this model, of course, was famously developed in the United States at the turn of the 20th century in the context of oligarchic patronal domination of US media, but then re-elaborated in the middle of the Cold War as the US journalists were trying to export their understanding of media autonomy and media professionalism elsewhere. Now, I have a part here which is all about how anthropology has been very bad at recognizing exactly these kinds of sort of elite struggles and elite elaborations of political subjectivity and political thought, but I'm going to skip that. I'll just say that understanding the life worlds of these people these journalists and this sort of people fighting for media emancipation requires paying close attention to their thought, the micro-sociology of their work, and the macro-sociology of the political blocs that they have allied with, and the economic forces that have shaped the circumstances within which they make their lives. So basically, this requires doing a holistic anthropology, which is what anthropology is good at, but at a scale that isn't particularly comfortable with. It is this exercise of fieldwork in philosophy, conjoined with political economy critique, that I will outline in the remainder of this lecture. So, in the USSR of the late 1980s, perestroika and glasnost kickstarted a comprehensive transformation of the journalistic profession, affecting the system of media genres, redefining what counted as newsworthy truth, and changing editors' relation with the communist elites. From being the party's critical friends, as some have put it, journalists became party's critics. Journalistic experiments with the new discursive regime unfolded unevenly in metropolitan and peripheral regions, but everywhere they revealed shifting power relations between the media professions and the authorities. And I think there's many people here who know this a lot better than I do. But A.A. Chichanovsky, an instructor at the higher party school in Kyiv, complained rather petulantly in 1989 that some Ukrainian journalists and editors understood perestroika as, quote, an opportunity to come out from under the party's committee control as complete autonomy. What nonsense, right? But these were the first signs of a comprehensive transformation in which the journalists would carve out a new professional jurisdiction no longer encompassed by the state. With the collapse of the USSR, editorial independence from the administrative commands and interventions from above, as they were kind of commonly referred to, became a core ideal of this transforming media profession. But the conditions for the realization of this autonomy were at best unstable. Across the region, the first steps of mass media in a new capitalist market coincided with a long period of economic and political crisis. In the first post-Soviet decade, Ukraine lost 60% of its GDP. Since then, it had never reached the 1989 levels of prosperity because it went through a series of ever deeper economic crises. Currently, last year, Ukraine lost 30% of its GDP due to the invasion. And media lost 90% in the first year, up to 90% of the traditional revenue sources. So the economic downturn in the 90s shrank consumer demand, strained the fledgling advertisement market, and forced media workers to look for alternative sources of revenues. One such source was private donations from businessmen who had made significant amounts of money and who were now intent on moving into positions of political power. For these emergent patrons, media influence was an instrument in running for public office or building political alliances, which in turn helped to secure their unstable property rights, protect their businesses from enforcement of legal rules, and expanded their commercial opportunities. Rather reluctantly, the anthropologist Natalia Rudakova wrote about Russia, journalists began to enter political economic alliances with their private sponsors. This privatization of editorial agendas undermined editorial independence, while the fact that journalists were paid to wage so-called information wars on behalf of competing political economic factions fragmented corporate loyalties and solidarity within the profession. And I mean, in fact, I think they did so in a really profound and damaging way. In Kyiv, this fragmented media profession developed an uneasy relationship with the government, as throughout the 90s, one administration after another sought to re-establish media controls in what was becoming an increasingly pluralistic field. For example, in the year 2000 alone, member of parliament and businessman Alexander Volkov claimed that in conversation with President Kuchma, this comes out of the Melnichenko tapes, he claimed that he paid $90,000 a month in salaries to the staff of the then largest commercial TV channel 1+1, which was part owned by an enterprise, SME Media Enterprise Limited, quoted on New York Stock Exchange, which at the same time in its yearly reports boasted to its shareholders that not one of the 4,000 odd staff that it employed were members of a trade union. The turn of the millennium showed just how high the stakes of journalistic work could be for those challenging patronal domination. In 1997, for example, according to one newspaper's calculation, Ukrainian courts received lawsuits against journalists claiming total damages of 90 billion Ukrainian hryvnias, or 48.4 billion US dollars. Only 1.5 million or $800,000 of damages were awarded. But you can imagine the costs of actually responding to these lawsuits. Another example. In 1998, broadcaster Mykola Kняжицький, a well-known figure in Ukrainian politics by now, and in media politics as well, used a US grant funding from Internews Network to launch a newsroom and grow it into a new TV channel, STB, which in the absence of competition gained fourth largest audience really, really quickly. In early 1999, STB announced that it would provide equal airtime to all candidates running for that year's presidential elections. And Kuchma was really pining for re-election at the time, after the first term. As journalist Yaroslav Koshev documents, the channel also, quote, broadcast excerpts from the daily parliamentary proceedings, which President Kuchma had banned from state TV and radio to prevent his opponents in parliament from being heard in public. So soon after the announcement, on the 23rd of February 1999, Kняжицький's security advisor, a former police colonel, was killed. 3 days later, on the 26th of February, the camera and tapes of one of the cameramen were stolen in Lviv. On the 1st of March, the cellar under Kняжицький's flat was set on fire. On the 3rd of March, 2 people wearing masks broke into the flat of Dmitry Dakhno, commercial director of STB, where he resided with his 8 months pregnant wife and threatened them with a knife. On the 24th of June, an editor, Mariana Chorna, was found hanging in her flat. The murder, or the hanging, was not solved, but the police said it was suicide. In parallel, the state tax office launched half a dozen inspections of STB's books in half a year and eventually froze the channel's bank account. The channel's broadcasting license was suspended. All of this in half a year, right? So just imagine what it was like to go through that process. STB sought to appease Kuchma in September with favorable news coverage, while owners complained to the US ambassador and State Department, but to no result. Seeing an opportunity, the Russian oil company Lukoil moved in to purchase STB in October 1999. It later would sell the channel to Kuchma's son-in-law, Viktor Pinchuk, who was first among the new oligarchs to start building a media holding company with multiple channels. And this was one of the several cases where foreign capital, and specifically Russian part oligarchy capital, would mediate the transfer of assets, which would, media assets which would begin as independent media, would then be bought up by Russian capital, to be very soon bought out in the early to mid 2000s by Ukrainian oligarchs. So this was one of many examples in the run-up to the elections where Kuchma's administrative resource, as it was called, combined with extra-legal violence to intimidate and control broadcast and print media. Elsewhere, for instance at Inter, the third national channel, patrons from the Social Democratic Party United, led by no one else, Viktor Medvedchuk, pioneered a different system of censorship, the so-called temniki, or regular directives on reporting topics and angles. Temniki were actually invented by the gallerist and Russian gallerist and political consultant Marat Gelman. He confessed to that in 2006. So temniki often included exact phrasing which were to be used on specific events, and they took away the creative autonomy of the journalistic work, and there were also punishments for not sticking to them. When Medvedchuk became Kuchma's chief of staff in 2002, he extended the regime of temniki censorship to all national broadcasters. The introduction of temniki and the brutal murder of journalist Georgi Gongadze, as it would later turn out on President Kuchma's direct orders, led a group of about 100 broadcast and print journalists and media NGO staff in Kyiv to form the Kyiv Independent Media Trade Union in 2002. Members of this group also set up the Independent Broadcasters Association and an NGO and media criticism website, Telekritika, which would later be renamed into Detektor Media, which it remains today. There were other organizations, but these organizations in sum would become the core of the media reform movement that would most consistently take up the late Soviet value of editorial independence and autonomy in their struggle against media political clientelism and state censorship. Formed in response to centralized censorship, this group struggled for labor rights, or initially struggled for labor rights of media workers, and for their emancipation, and the emancipation of the profession as a whole. With time, however, it would abandon this universalistic aspiration to emancipate the profession as a whole through solidarity, but at the time, labor solidarity across different employment organizations was really important and also remained possible. Thus, it was the independent trade union that organized journalist strike committees during the so-called journalist revolution that preceded the Orange Revolutions of winter 2004. Journalists felt the political subjection first and foremost as subordination of their labor. So for instance, in 2004, Lesa Sakada said in an interview with Telekritika that working for a current affairs program at 1+1, the leading broadcaster, she was, quote, unfortunately only a soldier. My commander told me to say certain words, and I did. Right? So notice this sort of hierarchical relation that she's conveying. So in this political language of journalist protests, we hear time and again the use of tropes of slavery, serfdom, servitude, and other forms of unfree labor to describe censorship exercised either through threats of political violence or through sheer economic power of employers. And kind of hold on to that thought. The Orange Revolution, of course, spelled the end to Temnike. Vachtan Kipiani, a whistleblower of this system of censorship, wrote in 2005, and Kipiani worked for 1+1 at the time, he wrote in 2005 that, quote, the editor-in-chief is now free to choose topics and people that comment on the topics of the day. The journalist is free as his conscience is free, as he is professional. Right? So this is sort of link between personal virtue and the freedom of the profession. Very quickly, however, Kipiani's colleagues in the fledgling media reform movement began to complain of a new form of patronal domination, built not on centralized compulsion, but on decentralized corrupt payments. The cause of this can be traced to the changes in the Ukrainian political system that happened around the time of the Orange Revolution. So, during Kuchma's two terms, regional business networks, most notably from Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk, grew into financial industrial groups that combined control of heavy industrial assets with media power and political influence. Arbitrating among these oligarchic groups, Kuchma built a system of patronage that gave him vast powers. Wary that his successor would inherit it and use it to attack the oligarchs, among whom was his son-in-law, Pinchuk, Kuchma also pushed through constitutional reforms that moved the center of power from the presidency to the parliament. His successor, Viktor Yushchenko, took up office in 2005, facing a strengthened, perennially embattled legislature that became the center stage for the rivalry of wealthy businessmen supporting different factions. To exercise influence in the parliament, the oligarchs used their rapidly increasing wealth to launch new TV channels and papers. Political scientists Stanislav Markus and Wolha Charnish calculate that between 2006 and 2012, of the wealthiest 117 Ukrainians whose total wealth equaled some 60% of Ukraine's GDP, 16% were major media owners and 54% financed parliamentary parties. Media ownership and party funding allowed the oligarchs to protect and extend their wealth more effectively than another popular strategy, direct competition for political office. Parties and so indirect sort of influence was more effective. Parties and patrons who could not afford to acquire their own media, so the poorer oligarchs, bought airtime, the minigarchs, bought airtime and page space in a practice known as jinsa. Jinsa, an advertorial-like commercial arrangement, wherein a commercial Jinsa is an advertorial-like commercial arrangement in which a commissioned news report promotes patrons' interests under the cover of legitimate news. I mean, I think the word payola or advertorial kind of get it across. But etymologically, it's really interesting, right? So the term is related to jinse, jeans, the quintessential object of late Soviet black market trade and consumer desire, which were increasingly available as cheap counterfeits of Western denim brands flooded post-Soviet market stalls. As with knockoff clothes, jinsa presented something as what it is not, right? So manipulative advertisement as impartial, truthful news. It's a knockoff. It is related to other kinds of informal influence, such as the use of news for character assassination, black PR, publication of compromising material, kompromat, and commission stories, or zakazucha. So, I mean, just the wealth of these words. I mean, this is the proverbial story of the Inuit 40 words for snow, right? I mean, the wealth of these practices is such that you need all these different words to baptize them. But Jinsa is also distinguished from all of these practices by being mostly voluntary commercial arrangement between a buyer of publicity, for instance, a politician or a company, and its seller. So once individual journalists or editors, now increasingly commercial and media organizations, and various politicians. So the media reform movement, which by mid-2000 was funded by abundant US and Swedish democracy promotion grants, gradually was switching its attention to fighting journalistic corruption, or Jinsa. This was a pivotal moment because Jinsa, the worst enemy of journalism, in the words of one Hromadske staffer, has remained a counterpoint to visions of professional, virtuous reporting among Ukrainian journalists until today. And this is partly what was opposed when they opposed when the reformers opposed Medvedchuk's channels. My interlocutors' disapproving talk about the place of money in their work captured well what they found problematic about Jinsa. For instance, Anton, a senior political correspondent in Hromadske TV, not his real name, once told me that the role of a journalist was not to make money. A real journalist is the one who doesn't do Jinsa. He was a very serious man. Similarly, Yevhen Hlibovitsky, one long-time member of this reform movement, turned strategy consultant who sat on Hromadske's supervisory board at the time of my fieldwork, said in a media interview, "The question of the journalist's value frame is very important. People who sell their journalistic body, люди, що продають своє журналістське тіло, cannot be righteous, не можуть бути праведниками." And this, selling out, is if not a tradition, then a widespread phenomenon in Ukraine. Journalists must ask more complex questions than what my salary will be and what do I need to do for it. Hlibovitsky's image of selling one's journalistic body evoked an old post-Soviet trope of journalism as prostitution, an extended metaphor for wage labor under conditions of subordination to paying patrons. It's a very popular image. I mean, Arsene Avakov even used it to denounce independent journalists early on in the post-Maidan government. I'm not going to quote what he said. One evening, over beers and smoked anchovies in Hromadske's TV small kitchen in 2017, a senior correspondent called Andriy told me about his job at a large news agency in Kyiv in the late 2000s. At one point, he had to cover for a colleague responsible for transportation industry news who had just left for another job. Andriy realized that the bulk of the transportation beat consisted in servicing his agency's Jinsa contract, it was a contract, with the Ukrainian state railway company. And as a note, I say that I've seen these contracts on Ukraine's Prozoro state procurement system. They do exist. And people run competitive tenders for them. The company, he said, was, quote, sending up to 15 press releases a day, and I had to make 15 news publications out of them. He found the news of turning corporate press releases into complementary news articles about the company not only pointless, but ethically uncomfortable. I mean, who wants to read 15 press releases a day about Ukrzaliznytsia? I mean, now maybe, but back then, it's... Andriy continued, quote, my editor probably understood that doing this really irked me and started to apologize, saying, you understand, buddy, this is how it works. It's like a bone in my throat as well. He would walk around swearing, said Andriy, saying that he had journalists working for him, not service boys. Здесь журналисты работают, а не мальчики на побегушках. So journalists, not service boys. Comments like this reveal what Ukrainian media professionals found most reprehensible about Jinsa. Offering, been forced or paid to follow someone else's bidding, as a journalist, demeaned and belittled journalistic work. Natalia Rudakova's ethnography of print media in the Russian city of Novgorod at the turn of the millennium paints a vivid picture of a similar alienation and humiliation of writing news at someone's command. As I interpreted, for Rudakova's interlocutors, the moral problem at stake was not commodification of their labor in the market of electoral persuasion per se, but the way it made their work, and by implication them, into subordinate vessels or into instruments of their patron's agency. It really stole away their freedom, right? Jinsa thus revealed the role of money in mediating journalist subordination to the mute compulsion, as Marx would put it, of economic power. The experience of domination in the context of the media profession fragmented by oligarchic patronage and jinsa has a central place in the political language of trade unionists and other members of the media reform movement from very, very early on and until today. For instance, in 2007, a researcher working for Telekritika NGO that monitored jinsa said that, quote, there is no longer any freedom of speech because all media have been suppressed not by temnike but by the oppression of money. This censorship by money, in itself a form of domination, put journalists and media under the threat of arbitrary state inspection. In the words of then head of the independent media trade union, Serhiy Guz, the danger is that there is criminal responsibility for this kind of corruption, and any head of police, tax office, or another body can bring any journalist to justice. In Ukrainian it sounds a bit different because притягнути до відповідальності is not bring to justice, but force responsibility onto someone. Guz also said, we will again lose the possibility to work freely. Right, so this domination was seen as a threat to freedom of speech and to free work. By 2010, when Viktor Yanukovych was elected president and a new wave of oligarchic takeovers a very intense wave of oligarchic takeovers of media began, the rhetoric of emancipation from dependence and domination was firmly embedded in the political repertoire of the Ukrainian journalistic profession. It was part of the effort of the new Stop Censorship movement that opposed Yanukovych's attempts to, so this sort of idea of domination or freedom as non-domination was part of the efforts of this new Stop Censorship movement, which opposed Yanukovych's attempt to reconstruct some of the old system of censorship. Stop Censorship, Stop Cenzuri, put forth a list of demands, for example, among them secure employment for journalists resisting managers' censorship at their broadcasters, self-government and autonomy for editorial councils that brought together representatives of media management and staff, and new legislation that would establish broadcasting as a socially responsible business, prohibiting media owners to broadcast biased news or promote their own or others' narrow agendas over the public interest. Right? So we see this idea of non-domination everywhere in what these people do. So finally, when in 2013 some of the core members of Stop Censorship founded Hromadske TV, a multimedia online operation that embraced the model of public interest broadcaster and really helped the revolution kind of come into its own, they described the channel as, quote, launched by a group of journalists who were disillusioned with journalism in Ukraine and tired of political interference into their work, and who disagreed with the controlled subordination, контрольована підконтрольність, of most Ukrainian media. While the notion of freedom as absence of subjection to the will of the state or patrons remained central to the reform movement, the contours and approaches of this struggle of emancipation changed. These changes exposed the growing influence of Western democracy promotion grants and tensions between the ideas of freedom informing these grants and the ideas of professionalism informing these grants, and the kinds of emancipation that the journalists were seeking in the workplace. By the late 2000s, members of the movement found that censorship by money was more decentralized, pernicious, and difficult to resist than direct centralized state oppression. The union could no longer easily advocate for withdrawal of labor through strike across multiple organizations, and documents of the time also suggest that after the mobilizations of 2002 and 2004, labor militancy declined. This decline intersected with an increase in the number of jobs across all types of media, and many of these media were many of these jobs were also informal or in grey employment, which made solidarity and labor organization much more difficult. And I have to say that this was, up until 2008, this was happening in the context of extraordinary economic growth of the Ukrainian economy, some 8% annually, which facilitated later oligarchic takeovers because there was a global super commodity cycle in the context of which Ukrainian exporters of steel, coal, and other sort of raw material and resources which were the oligarchs, could channel their revenues back into the media in order to use them as instruments of political influence, right? So there was kind of a global dimension to all of this. After 2005, key organizations in the media reform movement started to receive regular funding from US Agency for, so after the revolution, right? First revolution, from US Agency for International Development and the government of Sweden through several media development projects. The funding was abundant and increased further after Yanukovych's election in 2010 and after the Maidan revolution in 2014 when new funders joined. If between 1996 and 2004, at least as we know according to official reporting, Sweden spent just under $800,000 between 1996 and 2004, from 2005 to 2021, it gave more than $30 million, of which some 85% were given after the Maidan Revolution of 2014. We don't know much about US media funding in Ukraine before the Orange Revolution 2004, but between 2005 and 2021, the US spent $95 million on promoting media freedom, roughly kind of equally in between the post-Orange Revolution up to the Maidan and between the Maidan and 2021. A significant proportion of this funding was spent on organizations within the reform movement. It was, of course, nowhere near the budgets of oligarch-owned TV channels, which, in 2018 could run up to $800 million. Hromadske at the time was run on a budget of about 2 million euros. So you can't compare. Still, after 2005, this kind of funding allowed the movement to scale up its operations substantively. But there were other changes as well. Struggling to change the political economy of media in which wealthy patrons exercised instrumental influence on editorial agendas, the movement increasingly sought to change journalists themselves. Organizations in the movement rolled out media skills and ethics training programs which were very popular with the donors. Thousands of journalists went through them. And the scale of this effort must have contributed to the reformers' frustration later on. For after their workshops, trainees returned, now more competitive and more employable, to their workplace, but often continued to produce exactly the kind of news they had just been trained not to do. By 2014, leaders of the movement began to speak of individual journalistic responsibility for Jinsa and Zakazucha, or puff pieces, right? So there's a shift from solidarity to individual responsibility. And this shift is also not accidental. These training workshops followed the blueprint of mid-20th century American media training seminars. As historian and sociologist Marion Wren argued, these seminars focused on shaping media cultures of America's allies and enemies in the Cold War, recursively shaped the American journalists' understanding of press freedom and their model of good journalism, which kind of became increasingly focused on sort of unified standards. It was a kind of, what Foucault called the imperial boomerang. Now, this understanding of reporting after 2004 was being imparted to Ukrainian journalists through training, and it encouraged the judgment of individual reporters based on supposedly common ethical and professional standards. The movement started to redefine membership in the profession based on one's adherence to these standards. I think this was a major shift. The notion of freedom as non-domination persisted, but now biased reporting could be interpreted not only as a sign of domination by media owners and managers, but also as evidence of the lack of individual internal freedom or vola. Unfree people produced biased news, and people producing biased news were unfree. Slaves are led into paradise, right? Kind of you hear some echoes. Grants did not fund establishment of newsrooms or other forms of collective challenge. So the grants that were coming in up until the Maidan were mostly not funding establishment of new programs, new newsrooms, nor did they go to other initiatives that supported collective challenge to domination, collective empowerment of journalists. The movement thus lacked the power and political allies to implement their vision of free media. This changed, and this changed with the Maidan Revolution. Leaders and former members of the reform movement supported the Maidan, and some of them joined the new government after the autumn 2014 elections. So, for example, Victoria Sumar, who'd been the head of, for many years, the head of the Institute for Mass Information, joined a small party in summer 2013, left the institute, and by the time of the Maidan was on the Civic Council of the Maidan, and soon after was one of the key proponents of the National Front, so kind of a center-right party in the parliament, under Alexander Turchinov and Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Donors, which until the Maidan had mostly funded capacity buildings, training, and legal advocacy, after 2010 began cautiously to fund programs, so kind of broadcast programs and newsrooms, and after 2013 they started to give core grants to establish new media organizations. Such grants funded Hromadske TV, Hromadske re-establishment of Hromadske Radio, the reform of Suspilne, or the Ukrainian Public Broadcasting Corporation, and a range of other small organizations which kind of broaden out this niche of independent journalism in Ukraine. This enlargement of this niche has meant that young and veteran journalists working for the independent media could now sustain a career, perhaps less well paid and more precarious than in commercial media, certainly not as sort of inducive of fame, which completely avoided the domination by patrons, even if it exposed them to the impersonal discipline of donor projects and auditing and FOPs. Ukrainians will know what that is. Sort of self-employment type of arrangements, because of course all of these media were engaged in not employing the people working for them, but they're giving them self-employment contracts. The reform movement had been started by activist journalists who shared the workplace with other laboring like them under the domination of oligarchs and state censorship. But by 2021, this movement was led by people who had for nearly 2 decades made their living off foreign grants, and among its supporters were those who had never had to work for oligarch-owned media, or who could be secure that they had left that kind of past behind them because they could continue working for grant-funded or commercial media. The problem of domination thus increasingly was other people's problem. Moreover, these reformers saw the post-Maidan state, although not the governments leading it, as an ally. Prominent members of the movement were now on the board of the public broadcaster and on the National Broadcasting Council, the regulating body. The reformist lawyers drafted media bills, and the campaigners promoting new media regulations could for the first time since 2005 entertain the hope of using state power to transform their profession. The Russian propaganda in Ukraine likewise emphasized the urgent need of such a transformation. It was at this point in the political and intellectual life of the reform movement that its members encountered the sanctions against Kozak and Medvedchuk. They embraced them because they no longer considered journalists at Zik, News 1 or 112 to be free or indeed to be journalists. In the absence of effective form of professional self-regulation or other forms of collective power, the government ban on these media finally offered an opportunity to the reformists to once and for all exclude those hated organizations from the profession. I think it is telling, and I'm concluding here, that responding to the sanctions, the independent trade union praised the content but warned against the form of the sanctions. It said that arbitrary sanctions were the fastest road to exactly the forms of domination that the reform movement has spent 2 decades fighting. I've argued that journalists' broad support for the sanctions was at least partly motivated by an idea of freedom as non-domination. Taken up by Solidarity and Reform movement in the early 2000s, this idea developed in interaction with the imperatives of grant projects that promoted freedom of speech. It responded to the kinds of domination that flourished in Ukraine's media labor market, dominated by employers and patrons. Tracing the transformations of the media reform movement through its struggles to emancipate the profession from domination, I have sought to demonstrate what liberty looked like in the context of Ukraine's actually existing liberalism. Thank you.
We're going to move your chair.
Sorry.
So thank you so much for this, Taras. I think this is super interesting, and there's many things that we can pick up here. But I think kind of one of the things that strikes me is, in some ways, right, journalism stands in as a sort of marker of things that are happening in Ukrainian society more broadly, but it's also constitutive of those things. And so I think that's very interesting. But Mary, I'll turn first to you and kind of, I wonder if you could comment on what struck you about Taras's lecture here.
Well, I thought it was the most fascinating story. And I think what struck me was, on the one hand, journalism caught between the old state-dominated form of journalism and the new oligarch-dominated form of journalism, and the only openings, really, for these so-called honest journalists was foreign international support. And I think what I was thinking about as Taras was talking, in my research program, we used the term civicness. And we decided to use it instead of civil society, because civil society had become this kind of arena of NGOs that were supported by foreign donors and wasn't really what we meant. And of course, when we were using the term civicness, we were thinking about how public authority works, and we were thinking of civicness as a kind of template for public authority, where, in theory, the state responds to the public and there's a kind of social contract. But what happens in all our the conflict, I mean, my program is all about conflict in different places, is that actually you can think of civicness as a form of behaviour. It might include civil society groups, but it might just be honest doctors who treat patients, whoever they are, or honest teachers who are really trying to provide education, or neighbours who help each other in the midst of a war. And actually, in most conflicts and wars, civicness is ubiquitous. It's everywhere because it's actually the only way people survive. But also, even more interestingly, civicness is a political position, and this relates to your point about solidarity. And I've noticed it particularly in recent years in demonstration, in protests in Iraq, Sudan. You see this combination of opposition to corruption, to oligarchic systems, which they may call crony capitalism or the political marketplace, and to sectarianism of various kinds. In Iraq, the slogan of the protesters was, "In the name of religion, you're looting us." And so it struck me that that was very relevant. And I just wanted to say one more thing about civicness, because I don't want to take up too much time, is that we decided to do a special research program and look at different concrete examples of civicness. And what we found was that although civicness was everywhere, it was totally subverted by the dominant logics of oligarchy or sectarianism. And where it got some kind of space was actually in the encounter with the international. So to give you a couple of examples, one was cancer patients in Iraq who found they could be honestly treated in a hospital in Kurdistan that had been given by external donors on condition there was no discrimination. Another example was actually journalists which is similar to yours, but it was slightly different, that journalists in Iraq, I mean, the situation is so much worse than Ukraine, you can't believe it, and it's almost impossible to be an honest journalist in Iraq. But there was one case in which they became partners with the Panama Papers and were actually able to expose corruption. And there were other examples. But of course, by that, I don't necessarily mean that the link with the international is good, because actually the oligarchs also have links with the international, and they're dependent on international rents. But it's really about how trying to think about civicness and the promotion of freedom, in the sense that, very interesting sense that Taras was developing it, actually is not just in one country. It actually requires an international conception of freedom too. So there's a struggle going on at the international level and not only at the local level. So those were my...
That's very interesting. And yeah, do you want to respond to that there? The only thing that I was going to add is caught up in this civicness is, in some ways, I mean, it reminds me very much of the discourse of values that's so dominant more broadly, right? And so I wonder if in some ways this Ukrainian discourse about values is in some ways a discourse about civicness.
Absolutely, I think it is, exactly.
It's the Ukrainian discourse of values, which is a kind of a form of morality that thrives in this political economy.
Yeah.
What my broader book project is trying to trace in the context of the anthropology of ethics and so on. That kind of discourse is a discourse of impartiality. It's a discourse against interest, right? So they oppose the interest of others to values of their own, and by that they oppose the corrupting influence of money, and values become a symbol of that, of what it means to be free, committed to kind of, you know, the transcendent ideals that go beyond the determination of money in the world. So I think it is important not to fall into kind of an idealistic discourse of value, but we can hold a materialist account of values in a sense. One thing I'll say in response to your comments about civicness and the international is that I've been trying to excavate this multiple links to the international, right? So the globally circulating ideas of professionalism, the kind of notions of liberal subjectivity encoded in that, right, kind of as an autonomous person, etc., etc. One thing I did not bring into this is, but what I can do now is that it is not just the financial power of donors that has enabled these organizations, but also the political negotiation between the donors and the Ukrainian government happening behind the scenes, before the Maidan, after the Maidan. I mean, you see it in the memoirs of Mary Jovanovic, you see it in the WikiLeaks, you see it in all kinds of documents that reveal that diplomatic behind the stage, and that show that donors routinely, or the embassies routinely stick in for, kind of show up for their grantees to prevent them from government interference and government domination, which is one way in which that space of freedom, in a way that they build it up, continues, because otherwise it would have been squashed.
Tim, I want to bring you in here. I mean, I know that freedom is a concept that you've been thinking a lot about lately. And so how do you see this freedom as non-domination model that Taras has introduced here, and anything else that you kind of reflect on here?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for presenting this fascinating research. I'm going to, essentially what I want to try to do is, rather than resist the argument, try to push it further conceptually. But before I do that, I want to make a couple of maybe obvious remarks. One is I was very pleased by the ethnographic non-cynical approach to foreign donations, because sometimes foreign donations are a really good idea.
Yeah.
And they're I mean, I think in general, I mean, many folks, especially on the left, have gone very far in the direction of buying the notion that anything which comes from abroad is somehow suspicious and dangerous. But I think it's clear that with all the appropriate caveats, in journalism, you really can have a kind of alchemy where the people at the end are not doing what you tell them to do, even though you're financing their endeavor. And this is a point that I make to my Canadian friends when I try to get them to subsidize American investigative journalism. Oh, you think I'm kidding? But I'm not. I mean, because it just is the case that the sort of primitive digital capitalism that we have now doesn't actually generate the sort of investigative journalism which I think is at the heart of the project. And so someone has to be thoughtful about how the money actually gets directed. And then that, of course, is a point about how, the quote-unquote neoliberalism is not the same thing as freedom of speech, which is basically the direction that I want to go. So I want to try to push the argument further, Taras. I'm going to take your factual material and I'm just going to slightly reconceptualize it. The basic point being that, or my claim is going to be that the notion of freedom of non-domination here doesn't go far enough, because freedom as non-domination is still an essentially negative account of freedom, whereas volia is an essentially positive account of freedom, in the sense that we can now quibble about the Ukrainian vocabulary. That's not essential, but the notion of freedom I have in mind includes something which is coming out of the person, as opposed to just the presence or absence of domination. So in my way, so Kate was kind enough to say that I've been thinking about these things for a while. I mean, I've been thinking about them for a while too, in a slightly different setting. And I've come to the conclusion that the term freedom of speech, or even especially the term free speech, is misleading, in that free speech suggests that there's a thing out there called speech, and that's the issue, whereas really the issue is freedom, right? So, like, to give an easy example, I don't care whether your computer, I don't care what your computer is doing right now. right? I don't care what algorithms it's running. I don't care about that, even if those algorithms are busily persuading other people to do things, because your computer doesn't have freedom. It's not an entity in this sense, right? So for there to be freedom of speech or any other kind of freedom, there has to be a person, right? And so I've been trying to discipline myself to talk only about free speakers, and to see where that goes, because I think a whole lot of the conversation about free speech has been corrupted by the notion that you can talk about it without the person, right? And so this is not at all directly pertinent to what you're arguing. I need this sort of warm up to make my point. So a lot of the discussion about free speech, for example, on Twitter or whatever, has to do with algorithms, or it has to do with people who already have tens of billions of dollars. And at that point, you know that something has gone wrong with the discussion, right? Because it's not a person, or at least it's not a person whose rights are in any way challenged. Now, so the reason why I'm hitting this point is that if it's true that we're talking about freedom and that freedom has to do with the person, then the concept of freedom has to be about the person and not just whether that person is being oppressed by someone else. And this notion of freedom of speech, or of the free speaker, is actually available at the beginning of the whole discussion about oligarchs, which I take your paper to be like one more contribution to the 2,500-year-old discussion in political theory about oligarchy, basically. So in the ancient Greek world, there is a theory like this, which comes from Euripides, which was recalled I think in the early 1970s by Foucault, to the effect that a free speaker is someone who speaks truth to power. So the qualities of there are qualities of freedom of speech, and they are truth and risk. And those are the reasons we care, right? We care about freedom of speech because the person is taking a risk. So there's no reason why we should care we might want to care that Elon Musk lies, but we don't care about it as a matter of freedom of speech. We care about it for some other reason, right? So that notion of the free speaker, right, as the person who speaks truth to power and thereby takes on a bodily risk, is a positive notion of freedom, right? Because it has to come from the person who's actually taking the risk with her or his body. And that is in the setting, of an argument about oligarchy, or what we call oligarchy. The Greeks were a little more specific by what they meant, right? But that where, Aristotle says that you can't really have freedom of speech in this sense because Medvedchuk will have all the money, basically. I mean, he says you can't have freedom, he doesn't use the word Medvedchuk, but I'm going to later a lot. But he says that, somebody will have all the money, therefore it's meaningless, right? Propaganda. Plato famously makes the argument, which I think is beautifully phrased, about the two cities, where like the wealthy are in one city and everybody else is in another city. But the important epistemic point is there's no communication between those two, right? The city of the rich will try to manipulate the city of the poor, but there's no real communication between the two, and in that sense there can't be freedom. And so the response, so what Euripides says is that we may not succeed in overturning the city of the rich, but I'm being a little anachronistic here, but what we can do is we can challenge it, right? And our freedom inheres in that challenge. Now, this is why I think this is helpful, because so historically speaking, the Republican idea of freedom of non-domination is about joining the other oligarchs, right? I mean, the Republican idea of freedom, as it's understood in, say, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the early American Republic or whatever, is that, hey, Taras, let's you and I have a republic, and these guys are going to be our wives, whether they like it or not, and they're going to be our slaves. Okay, so that's the Republican idea. The Republican idea of freedom is I'm going to create a broader idea of the oligarchy in which slaves and women are going to, I'm sorry, with all due respect to Skinner, right? But this is the problem with the Republican idea of freedom, is that it's about saying that there's going to be a broader notion of oligarchy, which is perhaps encoded in a constitution. Okay, and so there's an inherent problem with the Republican idea of freedom as non-domination, because it means non-domination of some of us, but the ones who are non-dominated get to dominate everybody else. Which is why I think the Republican idea of freedom can only take us so far. It takes us right up to the point where the people who are being, forgive me that I'm using you as my example here, but where the people who are being dominated take the risk of saying there's something wrong with our being dominated, and they take a risk because Taras and I have the power, to do whatever we want with you, right? So that's where the Republican idea stops, and like where this other idea of the free speaker taking risks seems to be important. I think it's important not just, as it were, objectively, but also, I'm going to make the claim historically or even ethnographically, like Medvedchuk. Okay, so who was Medvedchuk? There are like a lot of answers to the question of who was Medvedchuk. Like some of you might have noticed that when Prigozhin was doing his march on Moscow or whatever that was, he had 45 seconds where he said something true, and like that sort of it's easy to miss, right? When in a Russian struggle for power, somebody says something true. But Prigozhin said, well, yeah, our plan for invading Ukraine, was always, we're going to go in there, colonize the place, chop up the assets, and divide them among the Russian oligarchs, right? And the guy they were going to install was Medvedchuk. Okay, that's the Medvedchuk that Taras is talking about. Or roll the time back to a book written by a fellow that Taras mentioned, Kipiani, to 1980, I think it was, The Trial of Vasil Stus. So Vasil Stus is perhaps the paradigmatic example of a Ukrainian, there are many, but a paradigmatic example of a Ukrainian whose notion of freedom of speech was, you have to say the things that you have to say, even at great bodily risk to yourself, right? And so I find it very interesting that like your story, at least at one remove, brings in this other tradition of freedom of speech, or the free speaker, which Vasil Stus certainly embodied. So what I'm trying to just to bring this down around to a circle, I don't find it at all surprising that people coming from a tradition where their notion of the free speaker is someone who's taking risks would not be upset by an oligarch losing the license to his TV channel. I mean, I think the distance is even greater than you pointed out, because I think the non-domination idea of freedom gets you like 40% of the way. But I think people who think that, and I don't mean to idealize the entire journalistic profession, of course, but like some of the people you talked to do think something like what I'm saying. Like they think that the point of journalism is to investigate, and this is where oligarchy comes in. A lot of these people, like the best ones anyway, cut their teeth on investigating oligarchs, thereby taking risks, right? Thereby taking risks, and a number of them also were war reporters, thereby taking risks. And I think it's at least at some point in the argument, like that fact or that commitment to journalism as inherently being risk-taking, which inheres in an oligarchical environment and also inheres in an environment where war is going on, has something to do with this notion of freedom as positive, right? So you get as far as saying the person who purveys biased news is unfree, but I will now do the idealistic thing because I don't have a PhD in anthropology, but like the correlate to that would be the person who speaks the truth is free. And I think like if you just invert your terms, you're getting towards the more positive idea of freedom, which I think is implied by your argument. So thanks a lot.
A lot to tackle there.
A lot to tackle there, and thank you, Tim, for. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think they work together, and this excellent comment, because indeed they push me further. Funnily enough, this project began with the consideration of an attempt to do an ethnography of paresia, which is the positive freedom that you talk about. And I agree absolutely that this notion of risks and the bodily investment in that. This is something I was trying to hit at when I discussed what happened to Esteban in the course of 6 months. I mean, once something like that happens to you, I think, or to people around you, I mean, once you go through those sort of mortal dangers, it doesn't just disappear. It stays, and it shapes how you understand freedom. But I think that that notion of positive freedom, that those people who say the truth are free, those who risk say are free, the paresiast is free, it is an inherently, or it seems an inherently individualistic notion of freedom, which is at work there. What I was trying, however, to recover was exactly the collective dimension of the struggle, for which, of course, the kind of labor republicanism, if you will, and I understand, I take all the criticism of the Republican tradition, specifically of Skinner's treatment of that, of Pettit's treatment of that. And I'm not a specialist in the history of political thought, but I found that collective dimension interesting. And I think a way to put this forward would be to bring the two together, you say, and potentially to see how one shifts from one to the other.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that was actually what I took from what Taras was that it was more than negative freedom, but positive freedom wasn't so much defined in terms of risk-taking, but in terms of solidarity.
Yeah. I just want to say, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I grew
No,
up,
I agree.
there was when in my house, we had when I grew up, we had a billboard which had things posted on it. I remember there was a cartoon which was posted, which had two little people talking to a giant person, and one of the little person was saying to the other, "Okay, we've spoken truth to power. Let's get the hell out of here." Which is my upbringing. But except for the second part. But I think you can reconcile the two, because you don't get, and I think the actual empirical behavior of the good Ukrainian journalists makes Mary's point that it is a common endeavor. No one is saying, "I am here all alone, taking all the risks." It's rather like people are helping each other out, and making maybe some, but maybe there's. But I think it's reasonable to test the hypothesis that there's a collective endeavor which is necessary to make that posture possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So we want to make sure to have time for one round of questions, yeah? So we'll collect a couple, and then we'll make sure to answer them. Ksenia, and then I see Julia, and then...
I would like to say that in the context of Ukraine, I think that just the freedom of speech is also a freedom to be powerful. This is the agency of Ukraine and the agency of journalists who were not just taking risks for the freedom, but they also demanded this freedom for people, just like Mustafa Nayyem, who started the the revolution of dignity. And this is something that people were dying for, and they still but they're still dying for. And in this sense, Ukraine maybe reacted even more fast than STB, within 6 months. But if comparing to Vasil Stus in '86, it just took a couple of decades for people who were afraid just to step out and to say one sentence in order not to be killed somewhere in the concentration camps. They started just going to the squares and demand something from authorities who were ruling them. And this is basically this opposition between the slaves who were slaves in the Soviet Union in these terms, and who started talking to. So basically there was a comment, but is it like this? Does this freedom gives an agency, and whether this feeling of agency is non-reversible? So once you feel it, can you kind of take it back because the obstacles are here, or that the environment has changed, or you failed in the war, or whatever has changed? Thank you.
And then Julia here in the front. Here in the front.
Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. And I was just listening, Professor Snyder, to your talk about this freedom project the other day, and it's so great to see it in the dialogue with Taras's project here. Taras, my question is to you. I'm fascinated by what in political economy we call responsibilization, that apparently took root amongst the journalists. When you were talking about this, the genes journalism, and how individual journalists refer to who practice more civicness, refer to those who don't as, this is they who are the bad apples, right? So there is individualization of responsibility for a systemic failure. You say that there is this kind of move to individual from the collective, and that the realization of the collective and the individual as they interact is important, but there is also systemic. For practice of positive freedom, there must be resources. And you've talked to us about how systemic resources for practice of ethical journalism have been systemically depleted over the years. So I just wanted to invite you to comment a little bit more as to, specifically on the element of what is this conversation amongst the journalists? Is it are they demanding an introduction of a system that allows them to experience and practice that positive freedom? Or is it still going to be some sort of mediation of donations? And I agree that money from abroad is not always a bad idea. Actually, in a lot of cases, freedom movements are saved by the money from abroad. So, yeah, I kind of comment on the systemic. I'm really interested about that, because we also know how that it's great to have donations, philanthropy coming from abroad, but it's not always the most sustainable financing model. So, yeah.
And Leon.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I like that you used the term poor oligarchs. In Latvia, we used to talk about mini-garchs. That's a good term too, mini-garchs. But I really enjoyed your lecture and how you framed this in the context of positive versus negative freedom in relation to the media. And I do recognize that you focused on a very particular period of time. You know, and although this war did not start in February 2022, that date marks an extraordinary period, you know, and I'm wondering, when you're talking to journalists today and you're framing to them what they should be doing, you know, in a normative way, and within this context of positive versus negative freedom, you know, what would be your advice? And I'm asking that because, you know, in my private discussions with Ukrainians, there are certain issues that they want to broach, that they want to talk about, but they also kind of like feel if they open up discussions on certain issues that may be harmful at the national level, because you are in this kind of special period, you know. So where do you draw the line in terms of what you report on without like harming the national interest of Ukraine, because Ukraine is so dependent on support of NATO member countries and the EU and this and that, you know. So what would be your kind of normative advice within that framework?
Okay, thank you. So we'll take those three questions, Taras, and then if either of you want to chime in, please do.
Thank you for the questions. I'll going back to the first one. You know, I mean, I could turn it back to you. I mean, do you feel? You gave us basically an ethnographic example of thinking about freedom. I think it's an interesting one. I share it because I'm from the same country, and I've got through many of the same experiences. But I like to look at things a little bit from a side, and I think looking at them from a side, I can see that demoralization is always an option. Demoralization and humiliation and this experience of failure, it does frame a lot of this experience of loss of agency. I mean, there are studies, for example, on labor by Ivan Rajkovic, who's based here at the University of Vienna in anthropology, on the spare parts plant in Serbia, about, you know, what he calls mock labor that is demoralized, people who are deprived of the agent, systematically deprived of the experience of changing something through their work. How demoralized, and, you know, just remember maybe your parents telling you stories about, you know, under Soviet factories, excess of labor, nothing to do, you know, they pretend us to pay, we pretend to work, that kind of thing. And I think that experience of agency and of freedom through agency is incredibly empowering, but it is maybe the memory of that stays, but it's something that requires exactly those kinds of systemic conditions to endure that Julia was referring to. Now, to Julia's question about responsibilization, individualization, responsibility, I've just written I mean, this is partly based on a paper I've published recently about the moralization of these struggles and the way in which the attention of reformers focuses on moral responsibility of individual journalists for what is perceived as a failure to live up to standards of the profession, right? And I think it's been interesting to me to try to trace the shift in the problematization of individual responsibility in that way. I presented a sketch of that. I think the form of that conversation, I mean, you're asking about the demands for going beyond the grants, basically. I mean, alternatives, right? One alternative is the market. There's a fantasy that the market will deliver, and the market does deliver, but the market is small. One thing they say is that because the ad market is small, on the television before the invasion was about $250 million, right? The budget of one media group, Akhmetov's media group, was about 900 million. So not all of, I mean, that isn't covered by the revenues. That was massive cross-subsidization from Akhmetov's system capital management, from the Mariupol steel plants and so on and so forth, and from DITAC, the energy company. So the market can sustain a niche for, you know, magazines like NV, for example, or in a sense for Ukrainska Pravda, for all its ills and poor editing, etc., etc. I'm saying this on the record. But more importantly, this movement for reform, it has produced a demand for public interest broadcasting to be introduced in Ukraine. Mykola Kняжицький was one of the authors of the law on public broadcasting. The movement supported some form of introduction of public broadcasting under Mykola Tomenko in 2005. But that was abandoned because it would pose too great a danger, they said, to the Orange Revolution government. But ultimately, with the help of the movement and these lawmakers who ended up in the parliament and a coalition with the Council of Europe and the EU, the reform was pushed through in 2013. And it kind of worked. The reform of the National Public Broadcaster, Suspilne, the reform of the state broadcasting company into Suspilne, you know, it happened with tremendous labor abuse. 4,000 people were fired. But in a sense, yeah, but I asked myself, maybe they actually needed to be fired because of exactly the kinds of work that that particular workplace sustained, etc., etc., etc. By now, or at least up until the invasion, Suspilne was starting to work with extra funding or full funding under Zelensky, because Poroshenko never gave it full funding, which is why the grants were necessary. But that is an example, and I think it's a good example, and it's large enough to sustain actually an ecosystem of people working there. But of course, laws and kind of guarantees are necessary, and one thing that's necessary that I see is a coalition with certain political forces in the parliament who will commit to actually writing a check every year for the public broadcaster. And the last question pushes me out of my comfort zone entirely. Thank you for that. But one thing, you know, because I'm not used to giving normative advice, but I feel that the way in which I framed the talk, it actually is partly conducive to that. And, you know, I'm making baby steps in that territory. I'm not going to give any advice to journalists, of course. It's not my job. But I think the one thing that would be interesting would be to focus not just on capture of grants or on the creation of new media that could capture market share and make money for themselves through ads or sales or whatever, but actually through struggle in the workplace to transform the existing oligarch or other owned broadcasters and media to transform the workplace practices there and to work against various forms of self-censorship and kind of insinuation and censorship there. There were successful examples when over the past 20 years where for short-ish periods of time these broadcasters moved into a new way of operating. The newsrooms moved into new ways of operating. I think it rests to see what's going to happen with the United News Marathon in Ukraine, through which the state distributes money to the select broadcasters, and I mean they're very, very select, and some of them are there for unknown reasons. One of these people who was participating there is someone I interviewed and wrote about as a self-appointed censor, who was very happy to talk about the way in which it censored news on one of the channels. Not to say that disqualifies her from the profession, she's an excellent professional, but I'm just looking at who kind of went into that space offered by the state. But nevertheless, still the de-oligarchization laws that were introduced, all the kind of legal problems with them, they try to break the link between the owner and the media and the political kind of interests of the media owner, and that might shift the way in which large broadcasters are making money. I mean, it might shift them towards an ad market and towards potentially grants as well. This was already happening. I mean, one thing I didn't say is after 2008, Ukrainian media were terribly loss-making. Until 2008, they were growing
revenues were growing by 30% a year, the profit margins were 25%. I mean, it was tremendously profitable. It stopped because the growth stopped, right? And so, for all of us, depending on what kind of reconstruction happens in Ukraine, that sort of reconstruction, if it fuels growth, the benefits of which are socialized in Ukraine, that can actually sustain the commercial growth necessary for these kinds of free media. I'm not opposed to that. But the journalists ought to be in a position to wrestle back the power over their work and the autonomy of their work, and the possibility of speaking truth to power and to risk from the employers. So I think it's two things that come together.
All right. Thank you, Taras. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we will see you back at the IWM in September.
Thanks. Let's switch that.
I don't know.